QSO Today, episode 441, Robert Glorioso W1IS. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts magazine. We are now just a few weeks away from the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, which will open on Friday, March 24th at 6 p.m. PDT, that's Pacific Daylight Time, with the Ham Radio Workbench, followed by a lineup of over 40 presentations beginning Saturday morning. For the first time, we have a new mobile app for both the iPhone and Android that will allow you to attend the expo while on the move. Please buy a ticket, as your ticket makes this event possible. For more information, please click on the banner that takes you to our QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo website. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Robert Bob Glorioso, W1IS, had early beginnings in electronics and radio encouraged by his father, led Bob to advanced degrees in engineering, a stint in the U.S. Army, and opportunities to be on the cutting edge of technology throughout his career with major corporations and his own startup. The consummate teacher, Bob has developed new hams through courses at the local ARES. W1IS has been a frequent contributor to ham radio publications for over 50 years, is a contributor to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, and is my guest in this QSO Today. W1IS, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Bob?
4Z1UG, this is Whiskey 1 India Sierra, copy pine.
Bob, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
It started when I was rather young, and in the Scouts, actually. And there was a thing in one of the manuals on how to build a crystal radio, and I tried to do that. And I talked to a relative of a cousin who was a TV guy, and he said, you can... I couldn't get a crystal detector. There was no way I could find one. He said, you can use a razor blade. So I tried that. It barely worked, and I got very frustrated. But I kept persisting at it. So I always fooled around with things like that. I took radios apart at home and figured out that the local oscillator was a pretty good transmitter, and I was using it as a transmitter. And that's how it kind of got going. And then I found in a local shop that carried magazines, QST, and I bought it, and then that got me going. And then I met friends when I got in high school who were also interested.
Let's go back just a little bit, because I kind of want to put you in a period of time. This was in the 50s, right?
It was in the 40s, the late 40s. I was 7 or 8 years old when I started all this.
So the radios that you were taking apart were tube-type radios, super hets, or the regenerative receivers in those days?
They were super hets. The big, my family had a couple of those big, high console radios. I absconded with one and started fooling with it.
For younger people that aren't familiar with that time, those radios came in gorgeous, gorgeous wooden cases.
They were furniture.
When you're at least looking for parts or you're looking for radio chassis and stuff, was there a lot of that stuff in the late 40s?
No, not until I discovered that they'd opened an electronics shop on the other side of town. And that was great. I could go down there and get tubes and wire and all sorts of neat stuff, sockets. And they had everything I wanted to get to fool around with. So it was really great. Was
that surplus from World War II?
No, this was in Connecticut, and it wasn't close enough to New York to be surplus. It was all new things for the most part there. But I did get to New York a few times, to Radio Row, and my father had a friend. He grew up in New York City on the west side, who had a shop there, and he would give me all kinds of stuff. I had enough earphone connectors, headset connectors, the 1/4 inch, to outfit 1,000 hams. I mean, he just gave me boxes of the stuff. So I had a lot of things to fool around with. Oh, it was great. It was a great joy. I had boxes of capacitors and resistors. It was wonderful.
There was a smell that I remember from childhood of those electronic stores.
Yeah.
When I smell it, it takes me back in time. It's a time machine. What was the hometown?
Danbury, Connecticut, which is about 60 miles out of New York City. My father was born and brought up in New York City, so he liked to go down there, and he took me there.
And were there a lot of hams in Danbury? When you started reading QST magazine, did you start to kind of notice things like antennas and other things?
Oh, yes. Well, I kind of found that most of them through a friend in high school, W1DDJ, Dirty Dirty John, Tom O'Hara, and then I got introduced to more hams because I located him, and he wasn't all that far. I was not that far from him, so it was good. So he introduced me to the club, which was the Candlewood Amateur Radio Association, which still exists, by the way. And I joined that shortly after I got interested. But I didn't really join until I got my license. I knew it was there, but I went to a meeting or two, but I didn't join it until I got my license.
And when did you get your first license?
Well, I passed my test, which was novice test in those days, which was given by Joe Feely, W1ADW, the winner of the first sweepstakes. He was an interesting CW guy. On January 1, 1955, I was 14 years old. Passed the test. I was pretty sure I got the questions right. The code test, it was easy because I practiced. It took almost 4 months to get my license. It was very slow in those days.
Right, and I remember I got my license sometime after you, but you get a package of sample QSL cards from the little print shop, and usually they seem to know, for some reason, your call sign before you did.
I didn't get that. This was way before that. I got a piece of paper in the mail from the FCC, and there was my call, which was WN1EBW, and that was the first reissue of that call. I got that in, I think, March of 55. So I got it in January 1 and middle of March. So it was 3.5 months, something like almost 3 months to get my license back.
And what was your first rig?
My father took me to New York to buy a receiver. I went to a Lafayette Electronics, and I got a Helicrafters S38. I can't remember whether it was I think it was an A or B model. It was one of the early ones. And then I built the two tube with a rectifier. I had a 5U4G and a 6L6 oscillator. And that was built on a breadboard, a piece of wood. And having 300 volts there all the time, I got belted a few times. I learned not to get too close to that stuff and to treat it with a little more respect. But I had that. I don't know how much power it ran, and I had an antenna that my dad helped me put up, and it was about 130 feet, fed with TV twin lead. We had a pretty good sized house, so he put up to the corner of the house with it. He was a climber. He climbed greenhouses to repair them, because the family owned a whole bunch of greenhouses, and he climbed up the roof like a monkey and put my antenna up there, and then it sloped down to about 20 feet off the ground. It worked quite well, I got to say that. Do
you remember your first contact on it?
My first contact was Tom, DDJ, just to test things out. And then I worked a bunch of other people because I had met them. But I can't really recall. I still have my old logbook. I could look it up, but I don't recall. And you were slowly learning how to run a QSO because I could copy probably around 8 to 10 words a minute by then. But running a QSO is a little different. So it took a little while to get into the swing of it. And then I got moving, and it didn't take long. About a month later, my code speed had gone up, and I was having QSOs regularly. The thing worked on 40 meters, so I had it on 40 and 80 meters, and I started working some people on 40. In those days, there was no such thing as SWR. We just connected the antenna to a coil on the tank circuit of the oscillator, and tuned it up with a light bulb, a neon light bulb, and that was it. And it worked. I mean, I worked on people, but SWR was really never even talked about much in those days because most people were using balanced lines and balanced tuners.
The antenna itself, was it mostly resonant in terms of its length, or was it random?
It was about 130 feet, but it didn't make any difference what the length was. You could load it up anyway. So we did. I mean, tuners really weren't that popular then, except if you had 50 ohm stuff. I joined the civil defense, which has now been morphed into many things in those days, and we had some Viking equipment and an antenna on the roof with a tuner. It was an 80-meter antenna strung like 5 feet off the roof. Can't remember what was one of the Johnson transmitters and a Hammerlin receiver. And I used that. I learned to use that one pretty well. We also had 2-meter links on AM to local towns. And I got my code speed up rather fast, but the thing that really did it is that I got my novice and I had it in March, and in June I went to field day. And at field day, I got to spend the night logging for W1VB Walt Glover, who was an old line code operator. I think he was on a ship or something, but he had an old bug that had been beat up and that he carried around with him. And his code was like music. It was just so clean and smooth. So I logged for him all night, and by the end of the night, I was copying 15 words a minute. It was just amazing. Just my speed went up like a rocket ship. And so I said, well, I can copy 13 for sure. And so I studied the license manual, and my dad took me to New York in June, left at the end, not June, July. After field day, it was in July, and I got my general and dropped the N, and became W1EBW.
So I have a question, if you don't mind my asking. And I've never asked this question before, but I kind of remember the novice experience, and I remember that you're a little bit older than I am. So it means that perhaps you were working with more homebrew and more high voltage. Would you allow your 10-year-old grandson or granddaughter to have the rig in their bedroom that you had in yours?
Yes. With
the 300 volts?
Sure.
Exposed and open and all that stuff?
The only way you learn.
Okay, good.
I have several friends who had the exact same experience, and yeah, sure.
I remember that if our parents knew what actually happened in there, whether we were thrown to the ground or against the wall from the high voltage bite, whether or not they would allow that stuff in our rooms now. Well, I would encourage. We've taught our grandsons to use power tools when they were really young, and I taught them to solder when they were 5 years old, and they learned fast how to do it, and they got pretty good at it actually. Now at the point that they're teenagers and older, they're actually proficient. So you got to start somewhere. Yeah, I agree with you. Power tools and soldering irons. You never know which end of the soldering iron is hot until you try it. That's right. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career? Oh, yeah, big choices. In fact, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I decided I wanted to be an electrical engineer. I mean, I was dead set to I was dead set to go to college and become an electrical engineer. I mean, that was there right from the beginning. I became so intrigued by it, and then I read everything I could. Go to the library and get the old books out on radios and electricity. I had some friends in high school who were the same, especially Arnie Insel. Arnie's in Chicago now. He had W1ECA, it was his call for a while, but he let it go. I just reconnected with him a few years ago, and the interesting thing is we had parallel careers. We hadn't talked to each other for 20 years or so, and our careers were almost identical. It was very bizarre. Well, I've noticed that you and Bob Rose have been instrumental in actually bringing some old hams back in, hams who were maybe even novices or generals about the time that you were just getting going, and they've come back into the hobby.
Yeah, we've done that, and we've also helped some of the old guys get licenses, which is who were always interested and never did. So we've been working with them. In fact, one of them that I helped get his license and helped him with his antennas, and now he's doing great. He was doing great as a ham, but he just had a stroke. I visited him in the hospital yesterday, and he's doing much better. He said, "I can't wait to get back on the air." So he's recovering quickly from the stroke.
And now this message from ICOM America. Got cabin fever? ICOM has the rigs that you need to get into the field or to update your ham shack with a variety of base stations, mobiles, and handhelds. ICOM's newest 2-meter amateur FM transceiver is the ICOM IC V3500 or the V3500. This 65-watt transceiver has a compact body and simple interface. Its features include simple operation with a modern white display, instant volume, loud and mute functions, emergency call and alarm features, and a 4.5-watt audio amplifier for loud and crisp audio. The ICOM ICT-10 is a dual-band VHF-UHF rugged portable that meets or exceeds standard military testing in its IP67 waterproof case. The ICT-10 can withstand any field activities ahead of it. Features include extra loud 1500 milliwatt audio amplified speaker, DTMF front-mounted keypad, 5 watts of output power, 11 hours of operating time, and NOAA weather alerts. The ICOM IC7300 is our favorite high-performance innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed every ham's expectations for an entry-level HF transceiver. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package, covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The IC705 features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts when connected to 13.8 volts DC. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. Micro SD card slot, and a speaker microphone, the HM243, which is included in the package. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with room for accessories and your lunch. Designed from user input, the ICOM ID5100A is mobile radio innovation taken to the next level. This rig offers an intuitive user touchscreen interface and connects with Android devices and Bluetooth headsets via the optional Bluetooth module. This mobile rig includes up to 50 watts output power, integrated GPS receiver, DV-DV dual watch, DV-FM repeater list function, D+ reflector linking, and SD card slot for voice and data storage. Finally, the ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band portable with D-Star and FM functionality in a beautiful handheld package. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex repeater regional worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet network. The ID52 features include a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display, VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it is IPX7 waterproof. You can share the Android app for D-Star operation, battery pack, and headsets between the ID52A and your IC705. So there you have it, the wide variety of complementary ICOM transceivers to open up the coming spring SOTA, POTA, contests, DXing, and EMS operation. You can find out more about these fine rigs by clicking on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit an ICOM dealer near you to purchase one or all of these rigs, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. So you made this choice to become an electrical engineer after you graduated from high school. Where did you go?
Well, I actually made the choice to do it way before high school, but after high school, during high school, I took the college course in the math and physics and all that sort of thing. I also started a radio club there. There's another story before we get to college that you probably want to know. I started a radio club. I was 15 when we did it. It was right after I got my general. And I got a call for the school, which was W1MPE. We called it Much Public Education. And we were allowed to put an antenna on the roof. And we got a rig donated by somebody that we put in the physics lab. And we used to go on the air from there. We'd meet once a week. And one day a young lady came in, and we immediately made her secretary. and she kept with it. And then we started dating in high school. And she wanted to she actually built her own rigs. She built Heathkits in those days, at that time. This was in the late 50s. And she had built a Heathkit receiver and a Heathkit TX40 transmitter. And they helped her put the antennas up and so forth. And then she needed to take her exam. So in those days, all you needed to give an exam, a code exam, and even the written exam, was have a general class license, which I had. So I was in 56. I was about 16 years old, I think, at the time. And because I was dating her, I made her do 10 words a minute. And she did, and she passed the test, and she became WN1MGA, and later on W1MGA. And she was a pretty good CW operator. She did quite a bit of stuff on CW. So anyhow, that's another thing that's ham radio related, became part of both our lives. And we've been married 61 years, so I guess it works.
And how did she take to becoming the secretary of the club? Maybe she would have done whatever you asked her to do.
I don't know, but she was very intrigued by ham radio. So we said, would you take some notes so we can give them to the physics teacher? I mean, that's basically all she did. And she said, sure, I can do that. And she did it. She had a good handwriting. She still does. And I don't. And so that's what she did. She just gave the physics teacher notes from what we did. And it was minimal stuff. I mean,
did she go on to be professionally in electronics and engineering?
No, she went on to become an artist.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. Does she still operate?
2 meters. She's on 2 meters.
To talk to you and to her friends?
Yeah, she talks to our son and his wife. They're both hams, too. And our friends around town. She's involved with our ARES group here.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
We have 2 2-meter rigs, one in the basement where I am and one up in her kitchen for her, with separate antennas.
Does she use the rig to call you down in the basement?
Sometimes she does, yep.
And where did you go to college?
I went to Northeastern University in Boston. I went there because they had the co-op program.
Which program was that?
Co-op, cooperative education, where you went to school and then you went to work. I wanted to apply what I learned as soon as I could. That was my goal. And that's what this school afforded me. It was great. It was a great experience. I went through your first, in those days you went through your freshman year, which was basically a full year. It was 12 months. And you came out basically having a good background in math, physics, and chemistry, and in mechanical drawing, which was very useful because that was when I looked for a job. This was in a recession, as usually. I got a job as a draftsman for a summer job when I was just beginning to become a sophomore. Worked there for a while as a draftsman. The company was Doman Helicopters, and then they were working on repairing helicopters coming back from Korea. And so they asked me to pull the avionics out of them because they needed to repaint the whole thing, interior and exterior. So I did all that, did that for a while. And then they were building a flight simulator for landing called the Landing and Takeoff Simulator. And it was built with a video camera and some servos and so forth. So because I was electrical, they put me over there to work with a couple of people in that group. There were only 3 of us in there. And I designed servo amplifiers. I was just the kid and made them work. And they became built into the product. And then I'd go back to school and come back and the job had changed. So that's what co-op was like. I'd go to, after the freshman year, I'd work for 10 weeks, come back, go to school for 10 weeks, and then off for 10 weeks and back for 15 weeks. So it was, you basically had 2 weeks off. It was like you were working or at school all the time.
And this was late 50s?
I started in 57 and graduated in 62. So yeah, I was 17 when I started college.
And so what happened after that? Once you graduated, did you stay with Grumman?
No, it was Doman, actually, was the company, D-O-M-A-N. In fact, one of the helicopters that I worked on is in the museum in Hartford. I couldn't believe it when I went in there and saw it. I says, I know that machine. That was kind of fun. Yeah, Doman also made 3 helicopters. That was another thing that I had learned about.
Did you become a pilot?
Not until later, but I did.
Helicopter pilot?
No, never did helicopters. I tried to fly one once when I was learning. Not easy. It really needs a different touch.
You had left the helicopter company and you were starting on something else. What was your next step?
Well, I was there for quite a while. There's more about the helicopter company because the vice president there bought a Bonanza, and they did, and the engineers there designed tip tanks for it, and they asked me to do the fuel system. So I did that one term, and I asked my boss. I said, "Can you give me a ride?" He said, "Yeah, kid, I'll give you a ride." I never got a ride in a Bonanza until I bought one, so it was a long time later. He never gave me a ride. But after that, I went to school, and then I worked in other places. I worked at CBS Laboratories, which was doing recording. We were doing the early 1 7/8 inch thing that became a cassette. I was working on that. I was working with engineers and scientists that had been brought in from Germany who did the original wire recording, which the Germans used during the war. And these guys were characters. And I learned a lot from them. And they brought a guy in from England that I spent a summer with there, trying to divide up the spectrum of the video signal and mesh it back together again and so forth. He was a brilliant man and fun to work with. I didn't know anything about him until I was in graduate school, and I opened up a book that I was looking at on digital signal processing, and it was the guy who invented the hologram. So I said, "That's Dennis. I know him."
What was his name?
Dennis Gabor. That was a great experience. Anyhow, so I had a lot of interesting experiences through school, and then after undergraduate school, I decided that one of the things through the years is I always liked to teach people things. So through undergraduate school, I would coach my classmates because I lived in a engineering fraternity, and so it was not a wild place. It was pretty much stayed and studied. And I would help my buddies get through through the courses. So I would teach them the material as I learned it. And I also realized that some of the teachers that we had weren't helping people really learn. So I decided that I'm going to do that. I'm going to teach people the right way. And so I went to graduate school. And in the meantime, we were married. Dee and I were married. I went to the University of Connecticut graduate school in electrical engineering and worked with a couple of really nice, smart professors. Taylor Booth was one of them. He was my advisor, and he was still a great man. I did my master's project on single sideband FM. And there's another side story in here. A bunch of us, when we were in high school, started a net called the Kindergarten Net. And we would get on after school. We were all 15, 16 years old. I'd never met any of the people until I got to graduate school. I discovered they were there too. One of them was still an undergraduate. He had taken a break. And he helped me work on the single sideband project. And so we wrote an article on it and sent it to the IEEE Transactions on Communications, and it was published, which blew us away, blew the faculty away. So there's an article it's in there. I can't remember what year it was published, but it was called "Experiments in Single Sideband FM." Believe it or not, you can do it, but it isn't very useful. But you can actually make a single sideband FM signal.
What would you use that signal for? Not
much. It was more of an exercise. It actually had the same characteristics as FM, but it had also amplitude. It had an amplitude characteristic too. So it was AM and FM, whether you liked it or not. It had an exponential AM signal in it that you needed a strange decoder, which we built. We built all that stuff and actually made it work. And so, it does very much like an FM signal does. It spreads the bandwidth, and then as you receive it, you compress it back out, so the signal noise ratio goes up. So you can find it in the IEEE Transactions and Computers on Communications, probably in 65, 66, something like that. That's where I met all these guys again. Earl unfortunately is sick right now, who I did he was W1VPI. And so we became really good friends in college. Although we were friends on the radio, but we were really good friends in college. So, and we were also neighbors. He's a great guy.
Now, you didn't stay in radio. You seem to be like an early pioneer in computing.
Yeah, I did that. I did also was an early pioneer in user interfaces, which is what I was doing in computing. Yeah, I did a PhD, and my thesis was a stochastic model of the human observer as a detector of signals and noise. So it was kind of human factors as well as signal processing all at once. To do that, I wound up taking graduate courses in experimental psychology to figure out how to deal with the perception stuff. And then the computing stuff was getting the computers to put the signals on the screen that we needed to give people to run the human tests. I built an early light pen. Gosh, that was an interesting project. And then I did all the interface. At the time, the computer was so small that we couldn't really generate random numbers on it very easily. It would take up too much space. So I solved that problem by building a noise generator and a sample and hold circuit. So every time I needed a random number, I would just sample that and get the it was a 12-bit decoder, so it was what it was. But it was I get the 12-bit signal that came out of it, and then I'd have a random number. So it was an analog digital, because digital wasn't good enough in those days.
How did they go from there? I mean, this is your PhD project, but where did that lead?
It didn't lead. It led to some. The sponsor was Electric Boat, so they got the paper anyway that they were looking for, because they wanted to figure out how to do it, how to use some of the stuff we did in displays of sonar.
When you say electric boats, you're referring to submarines?
Yeah, Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut.
Yeah, for people that haven't read, like The Hunt for Red October and stuff like that, electric boats are submarines, right?
Right. They were the sponsor of the work. And so they got that. And unfortunately, one of the things that I did, both fortunately and unfortunately, when I went through undergraduate school, I also went through ROTC and came out a second lieutenant. So I was in graduate school as a second lieutenant, and after being I was then in the inactive reserves. And this was in the time of all kinds of strange things going on, as it is now. And I got promoted to first lieutenant after being in the reserves for a while without going to a meeting. So I graduated, and I was told by the government that I had to report to active duty in the end of June of my 5th year in graduate school. And I was working on my dissertation, and I got it done and had my orals and graduated like 3 weeks before I had to go on active duty. And then I reported for active duty in the Army.
How did you serve?
I started out going to, of course, signal courses down in Atlanta, Georgia, or Augusta, Georgia, rather. We had to go to Atlanta to jump to Augusta. And And then I was stationed in the electronics command, and this is one of the stories that you hear about the military that you don't hear often. They put me in a group called the Computer Techniques Team. And I had done work as part of my work on early stuff with artificial intelligence. That was one of the other projects. That wasn't my dissertation, but I'd done some other projects in that domain. And high-speed computing, I did some fiddling around with high-speed circuits. Anyhow, they put me in charge of this small group called Computer Techniques. And the guy that ran it said, I don't know anything about computers and computing or circuits, so can you figure out what they're doing and fix it? So I did. And that was fine. We decided that what we were going to do was, this was during Vietnam, and the mortars were coming into the bases there pretty regularly from the jungle. And we were going to use acoustic means to try to isolate them. We started working on that problem. It was a very complicated problem. And we made a little bit of progress, but not much. It was very hard to do. And the other thing that I started, because I had a lot of people there that were well educated that were in my group. They were mostly first and second lieutenants with masters and doctorates. So, we had some brain power there. And we started working on another project on, okay, right now, at that time, communications were coordinated by people sitting at switchboards with plugging in cables, because that's the way it was. We said computers are going to be at these nodes, and let's do the work that figures out what the computer can do. And we did that. We did a little bit of how you would send a signal down a serial line that would identify where it's going and where it's from and connect it. That was a while working on that. That was simply a simple statement of what we did. And then what happens if somebody blows up one of the nodes? Because that can happen in the Army. And how do you route around it? So we came up with adaptive routing algorithms, simulated them in Fortran.
Wasn't the whole idea of the internet, although obviously we call it the internet now, but at the very beginnings of this idea of creating fault-tolerant communications, you were like right on the cutting edge of that, right? I think the RAND Corporation ended up coming up with, TCP/IP or something like that, but that was about the same time.
That was later, actually. That was a little later, but yeah, this was the beginning of network routing and so forth. Our simulations worked really well, and we proved that you could do it. We could blow up nodes, and within a very short time, the network would learn where to go and send the traffic to the right place. And we published an article on it. The people that were in the switchboard work, we explained it to them, and they said, no, this is no good. You can't do this. And so I said, can we publish it? And they said, sure. So we did. And later on, I was getting calls from people doing early internet stuff that, about what we had done. We published a little article on it. I can't remember where it was. It was in an IEEE. I can't remember which one. It was so long ago now. But that was fun. It was really fun. And that worked really well. We did that well. So I worked on lots of things. They also had me work on the McNamara line. They pulled me to work on that, which was the dropping signals, little transmitters in the jungle with sensors in them, and they gathered the data. And they would gather data like crazy, and they had no way of processing it. So they asked me to help for the group. I was a special task force or something. It was not an easy project. We didn't have a lot of good base data to work with, so worked on that a little bit too.
Well, it sounds to me like you had a very broad range of problems to solve that certainly expanded your expertise amongst an even larger range of things.
Yeah, it did. My PhD dissertation was published in Perception and Psychophysics. So
I guess the question is that a person like you, with the experience that you have, you may have had lots and lots of choices when it came time to taking the next opportunity. Was that how you perceived it at the time, and was that how people perceived you?
I don't know how people perceived me. I think they perceived me more as kind of a wild man.
Well, I guess they hired you. I mean, maybe that was the question I'm asking. It seems to me that sometimes somebody with your breadth and experience amongst a whole lot of things is kind of hard to put into a box.
That's right, and that's a challenge. That was a challenge all along. What I did when I got out of the service in '67 is I took a job as an assistant professor of electrical engineering. We became electrical and computing engineering shortly after that at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. It helped put the computer engineering program together. I was one of three that we brought in, and there were a few people in computer science that came out of the computing group, the people that ran the computer systems there. There are only a few of us. And the computer science department wanted to start a PhD program because they were only masters at the time. And, there were just, as I said, like 5 or 6 of us all together. And for a short time, I was the chairman of the PhD program in computer science there. But that didn't last too long because it grew faster and I had other things to do. But we developed a curriculum. It was on an NSF group that did curriculum development that we could spread to other schools, which was very interesting work. And I had a lot of interesting graduate students. And so it was great fun.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Now, how did ham radio play in all of this? When you were in the service, were you also active on the air?
A little bit, not very much, because time was of essence. My wife and I still had 2-meter rigs between the house and the car all the way through that. I built 2-meter radios, transmitters. They were in tubes, of course, in those days. One of the things I did that I didn't mention in undergraduate school is I built for my senior project, I built a solid-state 2-meter handheld transceiver AM. That's what it was back in the 50s. And it was in Q Street, December 63, I think. December 63. I think it's the first handheld 2-meter rig, solid-state 2-meter rig that was published. It would use a super-generative detector and a 3-stage transmitter with a strange AM modulator that modulated the driver and the final. Worked great. Put out all of about 100 milliwatts. But I was able to, handheld from a hill, work 20 miles with it. It was a lot of fun. Ham radio is all kind of woven into my whole life.
I'm just curious in terms of the timing. Was there FM portables available? I think the Motorola Handy Talkie, like I think the HT200, might have been maybe that was later?
That was a little later. Yeah, this was just a little after that. In fact, I met the guy at Motorola who did some of that work, and it was shortly after what I had done. But what I had done was crude. I mean, the transistors available then, the highest frequency, the ones I used, had cutoff frequencies of 150 megahertz, so making them work on 2 meters was a little bit interesting. And I did it by using grounded base configuration, so I didn't have to deal with the capacitance. And that worked. That's how I made it work.
It seems to me that you've never been afraid of publishing, and publishing for amateur radio magazines is something you've done all along the way.
Absolutely, yeah. Try to give back.
So people can benefit from the education that you've had.
And the errors that I've made.
And the errors that you've made, yeah. Oftentimes I find when I'm looking at YouTube videos of people doing things, I'm actually looking for the problems in their attempts to solve them, the things that burned up.
Right.
It helps me avoid stepping into the same problem and knowing that someone's already been there before. Okay, so it sounds to me like with this amazing technical background, this assistant professorship that you had, it seemed to me the next step would be for you to enter the corporate sphere. Is that what you did?
I got promoted to associate professor shortly, a couple of years later, and I was there for about 8 years. I had met Gordon Bell from Digital. He was on one of the committees I was on, and so I knew him. And when I decided, well, things got tough because when you start a new program at a university, the politics don't work in your direction. And the three of us that were hired never got tenure. It was really simple. There's a lot of jealousy going on. Anyhow, so I called Gordon Bell once at the end of all this. I had a professorship at North Carolina State offered to me, but I decided that I really wanted to make things. So I didn't want to go back into the academic world because you could only do so much there. I called Gordon up and I said, Gordon, I think I'd like to work for you. And about 2 days later, I got an offer. And I accepted it. And I joined the corporate research group at Digital Equipment in 76, something like that.
Digital Equipment was already making, what, PDP computers in those days?
Yeah, and they were just working on the VAX when I got there. And I worked in the corporate research group. And this is where I met Bob Rose, KB1 ESQ. I was in the corporate research group, and they assigned me to assist in the low-end group, which was doing the early solid-state versions of the computers, like the PDP-8 and the LSI-11. So I did that. I worked there for a while. I worked on a couple of projects there, and shortly thereafter, I had a whole bunch of ideas, which was always a problem. And they said, okay, well, why don't you spin off a subgroup called the Applied Research and Development Group? So I did. And that's where we did the work that Bob and I first worked on, which was, as you may recall, back in the old days, we used to have all the interfaces to devices outside the computer were on big flat cables, 4 or 5 inches wide, big connector on the end of it to plug it into the computer system. And I said, this is nuts. Why don't we use a serial line to do that and go back to the protocols like we're using for the routing stuff in the Army. I did in the Army. And so we started looking at chips, and we found some that were probably fast enough to handle low-speed devices, and we worked on a protocol. One of my guys in my group, Eric Peters, really nice person, very bright, like Bob, and one other person whose name I just cannot remember. I worked on the protocol to do it. It became the radio serial protocol, and we used a little tape drive that we had acquired, one of the guys in my group found. We actually made a tape drive interface to that tape drive and had it working. And they said, well, let's make this a product. And Bob came from the development group, and he was the engineer that took what we had kludged together in the research group and made it a really good product. We sold lots of them. So that's my experience in meeting where I met Bob. He's a really, really good engineer.
So digital protocols, single line digital protocols like RS-488, things like that, were those not done yet in those days, or were they just not fast enough?
We didn't have them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they came shortly afterwards, I think. I didn't really follow it afterwards. I just did the protocol and went on to other things. But there was nothing we could find that would handle I/O devices. I mean, it just wasn't there. We actually published the protocol in one of the IEEE. I can't remember. It was a conference that we presented it at, 77, 78.
All of us youngsters have to take our hat off to you, Bob, and all the people that preceded us for having all of these things in place, by the time we came around and wanted to solve problems.
Yeah. Well, but that's the way it is. I mean, I took advantage of all the things that came before me, and invention is the collection of lots of ideas that sometimes converge multiple places at the same time. That's what happens.
But I think, the hockey stick, we're way beyond the bend, right, in the hockey stick in terms of the technology and advancement that's happening now. It's happening exponentially compared to that time.
Well, the more people you have and the more ideas you have and the more the collisions you get, the faster it's going to grow. And there's just no doubt about it.
That's right.
And it's hard to keep up. I'm having a heck of a time. Not only because I'm older, because there's just so much.
What was Marathon Technologies Corporation?
Let's see. That comes down to, well, before Marathon, I ultimately became a vice president of the company. And I ran the high-end computing group, which was hundreds of people, up to thousands for a while, and putting out large computers. And one of the things that I got involved with was transaction processing. So I put the transaction processing stuff together that Digital had at that time, which was in the 80s, late 80s. And we actually wrote in my office, a bunch of us would meet at the end of the day, and we defined what the architecture was going to be for our transaction processing systems. But one of the things you need to do transaction processing is fault tolerance. And we had clusters which were good at one level because they would fail over, but you needed special software, application software to fit the cluster, and that was a little bit difficult. So we came up with the idea of a fault-tolerant computer, and actually my group designed and built one. One of my former graduate students, PhD students, did that project. I brought him in. He did that. We actually shipped it, but there was a whole bunch of stuff going on in the company at that time, and it wasn't very good. And so I decided that I could see that the company was having problems, and I decided that I would bail and do my own thing. So I came up with an architecture for a fault-tolerant computer. Instead of using unique hardware, which is what they all were, Stratus and all the other companies doing that were unique hardware, then I would use PCs because they were available and they were becoming servers at the time. So I came up with a way to do that. At the time, Digital was having major layoffs, so I picked the cream of the crop, and they all came down to this basement where I am right now. We had 9 of us, and we designed and built a fault-tolerant system using PCs and PC architecture using Microsoft operating system. And that was Marathon.
In those days, you were talking about using Microsoft DOS operating systems.
Well, we're just beyond that. We were just getting the first Windows stuff.
Like Windows 3.0, something like that?
One of the first Windows stuff, yeah. It was Windows. And we didn't really care what the operating system was, as it turns out. It's just that we put this underneath the operating system. But since the most prevalent one was Microsoft, that's what we picked. So we tailored it to that, but it could be tailored to others. And then we also came up with a way to do a cluster that didn't require specialized software to run. It would just run underneath. And it was only a 2-node cluster, but that was part of the architecture plan. But that didn't happen until after I left the company. But they still stayed on the original plan that I had put down right here in the basement. So that was Marathon, and we worked on that for about 10 years. We got the company up to a pretty good rate. We were just on the edge of profitability, and 9/11 happened. The whole market collapsed.
How was that related? I'm just curious to 9/11 in terms of the market collapsing.
Well, that was the end of the internet wave of companies. We had all kinds of startups that were using our stuff, and so it was, we had our revenue dropped 50% in 3 months. I mean, it was a disaster. And we also had a recession going on.
I was here in Israel when this stuff was happening, and I guess I kind of remember we were kind of engaged here with the Second Intifada, so that seemed to be kind of eclipsing everything else. There was a bump right at the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s with the high-tech industry.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was. It was tough, and especially with a small company, we just got clobbered. I had been there for a long time, like 11 years altogether, and I stepped down. I needed a break. I was having family issues. My parents were ill and in their last steps, and my in-laws were ill, and I became a guardian for my uncle who was ill, and I just couldn't do any more. It was just too many things. So I stepped down and let my executive vice president take over. And he ran it for several years until the company was acquired by Stratus. They're still selling some of the products that we conceived in 1990, a long time ago.
You know, you mentioned before we started, and you just mentioned again that you started this business in the basement that you're in now. You said before we started that your house is unique and that you designed it yourself. What's unique about the house and the design that you've made?
Well, at the time it was very unique. Now it's the way everybody does it. For example, it's got concrete walls that are insulated on the outside versus no insulation at all. The original heating system was groundwater heat pump, 1980s. That was heresy. The walls were 6 inches, but they also added another inch, so there was 6 inches on the 6-inch side walls. I sealed all the cracks, or tried to. I had to fight the builders because the builders didn't want to do what I wanted them to do, which is exactly what they're doing now. But you know, when I looked, I did a whole bunch of modeling of the house when I was laying it out, and I wanted to get the maximum insulation. I wanted it to be basically super insulated. And for those days, super insulation was, you put a 3.5-inch wall and you fill it up with fiberglass. That's not what I wanted. So I did a lot of things like that were unique in those days. I had the greenhouse in the house, built into the house frame basically, and the idea of heating my basement from the greenhouse was different. I worked with some builders and designed. We did, I don't know how many, probably 8 or 10 houses with some of these things, some of these ideas built in. And the way it works here is the heat from the greenhouse comes into the basement, which is concrete, insulated all the way around, including the floor. And then it returns back to the greenhouse on the other side of the basement. So the idea is you get the mass warmed up. And once the mass warms up, you have a little thermal time constant that's a little longer than it normally would be. And it's worked. It works pretty well. I did that in several houses that these two builders that I work with, built. And I estimated that the houses would be able to, in this part of this climate in Massachusetts, get about anywhere between 40 and 50% of their total heating from the sun. And that's pretty close to what we came out. It's in the 40% range anyway. And that works. So it was an experiment.
Well, it sounds like it worked out. It gave your builders a competitive edge.
Yeah, they were doing really well for a while until one of them passed away, and that kind of blew that one up. And the other one left. The other two, these are father's son. The father died, and the son's wife wanted to move to Maine, so that was the end of it. I didn't do any more work with them.
So we're through the professional part. Let's shift back to ham radio. What's the current rig?
Current rig? I don't have a single rig. I have a K3S. I have a K3. I have a KX3. I have a 706 Mark III Golf on HF, and I have a bunch of QRP rigs that I built through the years that I don't use very much anymore, but they're still here. And a whole mess of 2-meter rigs and 440. And I've been local ARES emergency coordinator, and we've got a remote base that we managed to make work down here in this infamous basement, and that's installed at the base of the tower where the fire and police are in town. We have 2 antennas up there, So, and we now have an HF antenna at the fire station, which is where the emergency operating center is, and we just got it up, and we haven't done much with it yet. We're about to do that now. So, yeah, that's keeping me busy. I get my hands on enough ham rigs.
What are the antennas at your QTH? What do they look like?
Well, they changed because Bob and I keep designing new ones.
You like wire antennas mostly?
Yeah, I do have a hex beam up, but on HF I've got a 160 meter off center fed that, based on our design, that was the first one we built for 160. I still use it; works fine. I have a end fed that we designed that uses a little different design from the others. It's what we wrote in that article in CQ.
So you were talking about the end-fed antenna?
Yeah, the end-fed transformers, the way they've been winding them all years, winding the primary right on the secondary, actually puts a capacitive load on the high voltage secondary, high impedance secondary. That's kind of silly. It's a low pass filter. So we wind the transformers. We don't use 49-to-1. We use 36-to-1 because with 36-to-1 the antenna is less reactive, as it turns out. And we wind the primary right over the middle of the secondary, so it's at the low impedance part of the secondary, so that the primary doesn't load down the secondary. Therefore, you need a smaller capacitor to get rid of the mutual inductance, the leakage inductance. And that really works. And we use capacitive loading on the antenna itself because there's a whole bunch of stuff there's not much of it in the articles, but there's a little bit. We've actually written a book. I should have bring that up. Bob and I have written a book that we're waiting for the first proof copy to come in today. And in that, we explain why it's hard to make a multi-band antenna with the low frequencies we have, either 160 or 80 meters. If you take a look in 3.75 megahertz and multiply that by 2, and then you multiply it by 4, and you find out you're way out of the bands. So you can't really depend on that. And then the other problem is that the end effect becomes less involved as you go up in frequency, up the bands. And so you don't get the loading of that to pull the frequency down. So the whole thing becomes a disaster. And that's why if you look at multi-band antennas, either end-fed or off-center feds these days, they tune them to the low end of the lowest band. So 80 meters would be tuned at like 35, 50 or something like that. And if you're lucky. And then the upper bands sort of line up. Well, if you look at the upper bands and look at how they're related, starting with 20 meters, they're pretty good. They line up nicely. So why not make the antenna, instead of for the lowest frequency first, make it for the highest frequency first? Well, when you do that, the antenna comes out longer on the lowest frequency. And your resonant frequency would be like 3480 or something like that, not where you want to be. So you use a capacitor, put a capacitor in the antenna or two, and that raises the resonant frequency of the antenna to where you want it to be, and it works great. My end-fed requires no tuner anywhere.
You're a contributor to a website called OCF Masters. Are the papers for what you're talking about now for these antennas, are those papers there?
Yeah.
I'll put a link into the show notes page. But then again, you and Bob have written a lot of articles, I think, that are also in QST and CQ, things like that, about these antennas.
Yeah, and those articles are there too. But the book isn't, which has a lot more in it.
So when the book comes out, we'll make sure that we have the link to that in the show notes for this episode.
The book's title is Wire Antennas from 160 to 70 centimeters, Concepts, Construction, and on the Air. Because we put every one of them on the air.
So what's unique about using off-center fed or OCF antennas? Is it the fact that you can use the capacitor to bring it into range, or?
OCF antennas are, if you look at an end-fed, it's just another idea of an OCF, and we can get into that because everybody says you don't need a counterpoise, and that's baloney. Every antenna needs a counterpoise here, or it'll pick the counterpoise, and anything around it will become the counterpoise. So that in order to get it to tune right, you need a counterpoise.
Right. So an end fed is essentially an off-center fed antenna.
Sure, the ultimate off-center fed antenna.
It might be using the coax for its counterpoise. The end-fed antenna is an off-center fed antenna, and that it could use the whole length of the coax as the counterpoise.
It will use it. I mean, you haven't got any choice, and which is why one of the reasons why we got into the end-feds is, well, two reasons. Bob and I were both interested in it, but we have helped the guy put one up, and he had RF in the shack that was driving everybody nuts. And there was no counterpoise on it because it was an antenna that they said you don't need a counterpoise for. And it was grounded and all the other things they tell you to do, and it still was RF in the shack. So primarily because the coax was rather short because it wasn't that far away from the antenna. So it doesn't work. So I said, this is nuts. There's got to be a better way. And I said, how? Anybody that tells me you can put up a wire and not have a counterpoise on it is dreaming. The example I use is I've got the positive lead of my battery connected to my starter, but I don't have it grounded anywhere. Can it work? The answer is heck no. Well, same way with your antenna. You don't have a complete path to your source. It doesn't work, and that's basically what you have to do. So why do you use an off-center fed? Off-center feds are because the impedance of the antenna as you go out from the center goes up. Which is why you have a high voltage at the end. And so you pick a spot in the center where the impedance is manageable. And roughly 200 to 300 ohms you can manage with a 4-to-1 balun and not have too high an SWR in your shack. And that's the advantage of the off-center fed, and that's the advantage of the end fed. It turns out it's easier to get an antenna with 36-to-1 to give you really low SWR on all the bands, and it absolutely does. So either one works. Depends on where you want the feed line to be. Sometimes you don't want it at the end. You want it somewhere inside. You can do that with an off-center fed. So either one will do the job. But you have to. The thing we did on 160 meters, we actually used two capacitors to load it properly, so that it will work on the lower frequencies, because 160 and 80 are tough bands, and it messes up 40, so we use two capacitors in it.
And those are switched in and out?
No, they're there all the time.
So the antenna is truly a multi-band antenna.
Right, and they're mounted right in the wire, right along the wire, so they're up in the air with the wire. And the 80 meter one only needs one loading capacitor. We use 150 puffs on 80 and 40, and then we use 330 puffs on the off-center feds for 80 and 40, and 80, 160, 80, and 40 on the off-center feds. You can't get an end fed really to work very well on 160. It's just the primary impedance. You can't get enough primary impedance to do a good transformer there, and then the losses go up. You're really managing losses when you're dealing with any of these antennas, but in particular with the end fed. Core losses go up.
What's your favorite operating mode, Bob?
CW.
You also like QRP. You said you built a lot of QRP rigs. Do you take those into the field? Do you operate SOTA or POTA?
I haven't. I want to do that. In fact, Bob and I designed an antenna that's perfect for that. It's an end-fed 20, 15, and 10 antenna that's really kind of cool. And I want to take one of those out because it's easy to launch that thing. It's not very long. Doesn't have to get that high. It'll work pretty well. We haven't done it yet. My problem is I've had back surgeries. And I've had 3 of them.
So hiking to the top of the mountain is not primary on your list?
Walking a mile is just getting to be a great accomplishment now. It's I've had, in the last 2 years, I've had 3 surgeries in my motion parts to keep me moving. It's been a long recovery, but I'm on my way now. I can walk a mile now without pain, so that's good.
Do you also operate the digital modes?
A little bit. I find them kind of boring, to be honest. I know I can get out to the world and with high and low power. I run low power. We have a place in Florida, and I run the KX3 there. And it's a condo. It's on the second floor. It's only about 25 feet from the water on the Intercoastal Waterway. So I've managed to, at 5 watts, work over 100 countries on CW with that. And that's great fun, it's a really weird antenna. Stick a pole out the window and use the aluminum frame of the window as a counterpoise. It works.
The reason I asked is that I noticed that one of the hams that you brought back to ham radio after 50 years of being out really enjoys Whisper, seeing where his 50 milliwatt signal is being heard around the world.
Yeah, Ron is one of and Ron's he's doing everything though. He bounces around. And by the way, he's just written a great book on the presidents that won an award.
He's not necessarily an electrical engineer; he's a historian.
No, he does a little bit of everything. He's an electrical engineer to start with. He did computers.
Oh, he's a Renaissance man.
He's a Renaissance man. He's done a little bit of everything.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Is there something that we could do better to attract people like Ron back to the hobby, or even new people, young people, to the hobby?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think one of the things we need to do is we need to get into the schools, and that's the hardest thing in the world. I know that they're doing it, that Fred's doing it up in New Hampshire. He's making some headroad up there. That's AB10C, who's the regional vice president. He's done a good job up there. We're trying to do that in our club, which is in Westford, based in Westford, Massachusetts. We got to get into the schools.
You practically need a security clearance to get into schools, I think, at this point.
Yeah, that's the problem. One thing that I've done, and I've tried it a few times, and they sometimes do programs for school children that run by the town, of what's going on in the world, and they've invited me to give talks about ham radio and emergency communications, and I've done that a few times. And I had a few kids interested, and it was hard to get them beyond interest because they get sucked away by other things, but hoping that one of them will come back one of these days. But trying to get some older people, I've been doing that too, and ARES seems to be helpful there because people are all interested in emergency communications, and that's brought a few people back. W1HLQ is back. He hadn't been on the air for years, and now he's very active on our ARES net. And one of them who has been very active with us, but he's not well right now, so he hasn't been active lately. I hope he gets back, but we've done that, bringing people back and bringing people in. We brought a couple people into the group. So we've been doing that. We're finding hams around the area. We found one just down the street from us. Peter, K1PAK, found this one right down the street from him, and he's coming back in. So you got to get him where you can get them.
I experiment with the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm thinking after all these years of interviewing now 441 ham radio operators
That's amazing, by the way.
Well, you're 441, so my thinking is that the low-hanging fruit are the people that have the licenses already that for some reason took the test. And those people are not kids. The impossible resource almost is kids because of what you just said in terms of getting into the schools. They tend to be over-programmed. They have too many things on their plate. They have no time. They have other distractions. And I guess radio is not as impressive anymore as it was to us.
Right.
I'm kind of thinking, and at least this is kind of the reason for saying ham radio license now what in the Expo, is that low-hanging fruit are the people that took the test, and they have the license. And there's hundreds of thousands of those just in North America that are not on the air or don't even have radios.
Yes.
What do you think about that? Should we be going through zip code directories of ham radio operators which are available online just to see who's living on our street?
Oh, that's what we do. That's exactly right. I, I sent emails to all of them that I could get an email address for, and then tried to find them. Yes, we found a few of them that way, and in fact, well, probably a third of our group is people that had licenses that we brought back in, and they're active.
What's their response when you reach out to someone who they're registered, but they're not active anyplace, or maybe they've never heard from anybody? What is their response to you?
It's variable. Sometimes they say, well, I really just don't have time to do it anymore. And that's the end of it. And some of them say, well, maybe I ought to look into it a little bit. And so I'll bring them over here to the shack, or I'll take them to the fire station if they're interested in what we're doing with the fire station, and show them the station we have there, which happens to be in the dispatch area, so that we get my theory on ARES is that everything is local, and trying to get involved with all the larger high-level organizations is impossible because the politics there are just too thick. But locally, the idea is to get hands in as much of the community as you can, so that if something happens where there's a massive power failure, there's a way to communicate with the various parts of the community. So that's what we've been trying to do. We've had some success. We need to keep at it, but we've gotten new people on the air for that reason. I want to be the local person in my neighborhood, and that helps. We have a drill once a month. Once a month that tries to keep everything moving.
And you're trying to build some community. I guess with ARES, you can build some kind of community around your organization.
Exactly.
I've seen these zip code directories in America. It's amazing if people actually use them. If active hams actually went to them and actually used them, they would be surprised at the sheer number of ham radio licensees that are within a mile of their house.
Exactly right.
Hundreds.
The town we're in has 6,000 people. It's a little tiny. And we have at least 100 hams. And I haven't looked at it for a year or so I suspect there are some more now. But we have about 100. And it's a small town, 10 by 10 miles. It's small. And they're all here. And not all of them are active. Some of them are becoming active. But that's what we're trying to do, is activate the group. And we've also started to activate the next town, which is equally small. And we've got several people over there now that are joining us. So, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. I'd love to get some more kids. I couldn't even get my own grandkids interested, primarily because schools have changed their philosophy since I went to school. I could do my homework in school. Now they can't. They take home hours and hours of homework. They can't do anything else. It's horrible. It's not good.
I had to drive to the north of Israel yesterday, and we took along a young lady who's a music teacher in a elementary school in Jerusalem. And so I was talking to her a little bit about what she's teaching, and she teaches the kids recorder. I said, oh, well, that's very interesting. I said, how is it going? She says, well, if they do their homework. And I said, what do you mean if they do their homework? She says, oh, well, they're supposed to take it home, and they're supposed to practice it and come back, and that's homework. And I said, along with math and everything else, when would they actually have time to do what you're suggesting? She was kind of like, well, are you suggesting that the kids not have homework? And I'm saying, well, I don't know. I don't remember having homework as a kid going to school, and it seemed it served me okay. And so it's kind of like, well, I see them walking on the street. They have backpacks that weigh 70 pounds.
I know it. It's horrible.
We're preaching to the choir.
It's not good. It's got to stop.
I'm an advocate for play. If they can't do it at school, then they shouldn't do it.
I agree with you. Couldn't agree more.
Maybe they do amateur radio or something, or maybe they've learned to play the piano, or
right.
But play it well. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now, Bob?
Oh gosh, what excites me the most? I don't know. There's a lot of things that excite me. There's one project that we have in our club that I'm really interested in, and I'm part of kind of just steering it a little bit. And that is, we have a young ham. He's in his 20s, who does Minecraft. And he wanted to get Minecraft apps for ham radio into the Minecraft. And he applied to the ARL and got a grant, one of the largest ones they've gotten. And I keep checking up on him to see how that project is going. He's got some people that he's hired. I think there's a couple in Israel now that are working on it, in fact, to help him get the pieces that he needs to have a ham radio You can build your own ham radio system and talk to people on Minecraft. So we'll see how that goes, but that's very exciting. If we can get into that group, because that's the creative bunch. My two grandsons loved, well, they're older now. One of them's a freshman in engineering school, so he's no time for Minecraft. The other one's sort of outgrown it. But that's the thing that really attracted people to build things. And those are the people that you want to get, because they're the ones that, I'm going to build a radio and then I'll do it for real. So, I think that's a great place to go. So that's one of the things to do, is to get into one of their games that they play online. We're working on that right now.
I've heard of Minecraft. I have no idea what it is. I guess I'll have to put that on my list of things to explore.
When my older grandson was like 10 years old, he was on Minecraft all the time, building things and doing stuff with his friends online. And he asked me for Christmas for a Java book. So I bought him a Java book. And he made his own game on Minecraft with Java.
Oh, that's interesting.
He figured it out. Now he's a computer science student at Tufts. So, I'm sure he knows how to build it. He's very good at that. But his other brother isn't into that. So I don't know where we'll go with him.
Do you have advice to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Yeah, get into a club. Because then you can see all the different activities that are available on ham radio. You don't see them if you just keep reading the magazines. You got to get into it with other people.
Yeah, but there are clubs and there are clubs. I think there's some clubs that you go to and people may not even notice you're there. So would you extend that advice in terms of how someone might choose a club?
Yeah, of course. You choose a club where they're active and that they're welcoming. I mean, that's the two items of any organization. If you're not welcoming, you're dead. Indeed, do that. But clubs are good if there's an active club in your area. And around here, there are quite a few clubs, so there are choices. But some of them are really active, and that's the ones you want to get involved with. And that way you can talk to other people and see what they're doing and check another guy's ham shack out and figure out what to do.
Or find an Elmer that could help you get yourself on the air.
Exactly right, and I've done that with lots of people.
I see there's a lot of poor advice on social media. There's good advice, but if you're somebody that is brand new to the hobby, it seems to me that there's a lot of nomenclature that we tend to use, a lot of short terms that we tend to use when we're trying to explain to somebody that has no idea what we're talking about.
Yep.
So finding that Elmer to kind of do that translation is probably a great opportunity for someone who's new.
At the antenna level, that's what we try to do in the book. We try to take people from basics to construction and why it works. Because a lot of stuff that's out right now tells you, here's how to put it together, and they don't tell you what it does or how it works. No, you can't. You can't do that. And that's one of my complaints, is that we've become more like popular mechanics than electronics again. We don't have the theory of an antenna. We try to publish articles, and they take the theory out and put, here's how to build the antenna in. That doesn't help anybody.
Right, especially if you have to tune it.
Right.
Or get the RF out of your shack.
Exactly.
I read something on Facebook today where somebody's saying that every time they key up their transmitter, their computer resets.
Yep, that happens. We explain that in our book a lot. One of the things that we've had a lot more people with a lot more trouble with is RF in the shack. We explain that in the book in a couple sections of it. We kind of build people up to it. There's got a bit of a pedagogy, not enough, but it's as much as we could get in there in the time we had to do it, and the other things that we were doing. So it's in there. It's not a very big book. It's only 150 pages.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing it when it comes out. Will it be available on Amazon?
It will be available on our OCF Masters website, and it'll be available on Amazon, both.
Okay, so I'll put a link to the OCF Masters website on the show notes page, and when the book comes out, you'll send me the link on Amazon, and I'll add that to the show notes page as well. Bob, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate it, and of course, everyone should know that you are a speaker at the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, March 25th and 26th, and you're going to speak about how to build simple wire antennas for 15 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters.
And 20 meters. Yeah, the antenna I was talking about is one of those.
We're anxious to engage you at the Expo, and for people that have not been to the Expo before, Bob will make his presentation and we'll have live Q&A afterwards that you can ask questions and understand even better. So, Bob, thank you so much. I appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast.
Thank you. 73. It's been nice meeting you, Eric.
73. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bob. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W1IS in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.